There we go.
Hello, my name is Lisa Carnegie. I work at the Heron City Library. Today we are having a oral history interview with Mr. Sam Stotlar. Today is February the 20th, 2012. Mr. Stotlar, first of all, if you would, give us your full name.
My full name is Samuel David Stotlar. I go by Sam Stotlar, so that's what everybody knows me by. But I was named after my great-grandfather, Samuel, who originally came here in 1856 and bought the southeast corner of what is now Heron. Is the southeast corner of that is 120 acres of ground, but that's where he came in 1856, and we've been here ever since.
Well, I know that now you live in Marion, but you're a long-time Heron resident, correct?
77 years in Heron, from 1927 to 2005, I think that's when I moved here.
I think
to
that
Marion.
qualifies.
That qualifies. I paid enough taxes in this town to qualify as a real member.
I think so too. If you don't mind to tell us your date of birth.
I was born on September 27, 1927.
All righty. And you were born in Heron, I
I
assume?
was born on 316 South 12th as our home, at my home. I was born there in September. I always relate that almost the time they arrested Charlie Berger and put him in jail, getting ready to hang him later on.
Right. And your parents' names, what were their names?
My father's name was Robert, or Bob. He always went by Bob Stotlar. Didn't have a middle name. And my mother's name was Eva May, and her maiden name was Arwen and Stotlar. And she was born in Heron in 1900.
Oh my
So
goodness.
she's she lived here 90 years, lifelong resident of Heron. And my dad he was in the big town of Fordville, which is now Energy. They lived on a farm which is just south of town. And of course he went to schools here, but he always corrected me when I said Energy. He says, I went to school at Fordville. So that was
They
the
did
name
change
of
the
Energy.
name.
Yes.
Yeah. And did you have any brothers or sisters?
I've got one older brother. His name is Robert Arwen Stotlar. He goes by Arwen, which is my mother's maiden name.
Mm-hmm.
And he's 4 years older than I am. And he was born in December 28th, 1923.
Okay.
So he still lives here in Heron, by the way.
He does.
He's been here longer than I have in town.
Something I was wondering about, just to kind of go back. Of course, Heron has a notorious past, and I just wondered if there were any stories that your father or mother may have told you that you'd want to relate to us.
Well, I'll tell you truthfully, nobody in Heron talked about those days once we got through them. They were so bad, and my dad opened a business in 1928, opened the lumber yard at 420 North Park Avenue, and it was there 1 year and the Depression hit, 1929. How he got through the Depression years, I don't know. It was very tough because there was not a house built in Heron from 1929 except one to 1946 after World War II. That's 16 years. And the only house that was built was Albert Starm's built right on Park Avenue, catty-cornered from the right across the street from Mary's restaurant now, or the Manetta Funeral Home was where there.
Okay, so Mr. Storm's place was where Van Netta's is now, is that correct?
He owned that house. That was his funeral home.
Okay.
His wife, second wife, was a Van Netta, and that's after he died. The Van Nettas were in the funeral business in Carbondale, and they took that over at location.
So he built that house, that became his business? I just want to make sure I've got this right.
The big house, the big white house on the corner, is not. He built it catty-cornered diagonally over on the other side of the street. And the address would be, let's see, it'd be 500 South Park. on that
Okay.
corner.
Okay. So I have noticed that there are some people that really, they don't want to talk about those days. They don't want to remember.
Well-
But you have such a good memory. I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about the good and the bad.
Well, I can talk about it because since my mother and father both lived here all their life, all of their friends were here, and I got to know all of these people that lived in Heron that were the generation before. And so I got to know a lot of people that were involved during those periods. I knew who they were. And some of the people that belonged to the Ku Klux Klan, we don't need to get into all of that, but the Ku Klux Klan that came here in that period of time was to clean up the bootlegging that was going on and the gangsters and all of that was going on in Heron that gave it such a bad reputation during those 20s. And so I've heard many of their stories, personal stories and things that maybe have happened to them. And in the last year, you know, our Historic Society here in Heron has really expanded the last 2 or 3 years, and we've been a lot of lectures on the period of time, but none of them firsthand.
Right.
And I've heard several of the firsthand stories. I knew personally the head of the Ku Klux Klan here was Carl Nielsen, and the other one was Mr. Smith, whose son later built the drive-in theater out here south of town.
Oh.
Wayne Smith, and everybody knew Wayne and his wife, and they were very active in Heron. But I did, while I was working, I started working at the lumber yard in the summers of 1943 during the war, and I got to meet a lot of these older people at that time that came in the summer times I was working. From then on, I worked at the lumber company. So I got to know and talk to a lot of those people that lived and would say certain things about that. But the Smith garage was this Smith I'm talking about. They had all the gunplay up and down up and down Monroe Street. So he told me a couple of things that happened there, and we've discussed them before between the Sheltons and him. And they had a big shootout. There were several people killed that day on that. But like I said, the other thing that was unusual about that was most all the major churches in town were involved with the Klan, because they wanted to get rid of this problem we had, the bad reputation and all the things that were going on. They wanted the gangsters out of here, and they wanted the gangsters that were fighting over the territory for the booze that was coming in. So most all the Protestant church anyway were directly involved. Their ministers were members, and a lot of the members here. So between that, you had a lot of people on both sides of the fence on this thing that was happening.
Right.
So it was bad times in the 20s. S. Glenn Young was the man that everybody knows that came in to clean up this town. Well, he just messed it up really, and they had to get rid of him and then get rid of the Klan out of here, which they finally did. But I know my mother mentioned my brother was born in 23, and he patted him on the head down on the corner of Heron Supply Store down here at the time. At that time, he was a baby of about a year old at the time that Young was in here about 25. So these are just a few of the little things that I remember people talking about at that time.
Well, a lot of times I'll think about, like, your father and mother.
Yeah.
And they've got 2 young sons, and, Heron just, at times was not a safe place to take your young boys and go downtown. I wondered how because they overcame it. They did. Heron has, I believe, overcome their past, and we still embrace our past. That's part of us. But I think that Heron is a wonderful town, and I'm curious about some of the good things, like when you were when you were in grade school. Can you tell us a little bit about that time? Where did you go to school at?
Well, I lived at 316 South 12th, and the grade school I went to was the South Side School. That was originally called the Stotlar School because that was the very southwest corner of the original farm. And the Stotlars came from Ohio. It came out of Winchester, Ohio. They were farmers and came here to some of this good Illinois soil they talked about, which was not so good when they got here, because we live in the old postal dirt area, not in the beautiful stuff from the glacier to north of us, 100 miles. But they came here, and they donated that property. There was a school there. This is a little interesting thing I think you'd like to know. In 1894, there was a little log cabin school up there. And a cousin of mine, Edward Stotlar, whose father lived owns out where Cane Acres is now, behind Kroger's, that was all his farm. He was in the Civil War. They got here in '56, and he was the oldest son, so he fought in the Civil War and got his arm about shot off, so he was back here. And they gave that school property on right at the corner of 14th Street and Stotlar Street. And the Stotlar Street was named because that was the south end of the city of Herrin. Herrin Street was on the north end. It's a mile long and about a half mile wide as the original plat in 1900 when it became a city. So that school was there, the South Side School. Well, in 1894, Ed Stotlar, the oldest son of Thomas Stotlar, was school. He taught school. He'd gone to Valparaiso College up by Chicago a long time ago, 1894. Anyway, he had 15 students in that school. 12 of them were Stotlars, as all my dad's brothers and sisters. There was 9 in my dad's family, 6 boys and 3 girls, and they were all lived right there by the fairly close to school over here on the south edge of Norge Plant. That's where they lived, and they were all in those classes of school. And later, that big old school is a 3-story school they built there in about 1903, called the Stotlar School. It's a 3-story, and that was the first high school. They had the high school 1912. They built the one in the present site out here. So that they graduated. I had 3 or 4 of my aunts and uncles that graduated there in 1912, 1911, 1910. That was the high school here for Herrin. And they had, I think you've got some books in here of the classes, those classes there. So that's an interesting point on that. I can talk all day about South Side School, I guess.
Well, when you were going to South Side and on the weekend when you would go to town, do you remember some of the businesses that were there when you were in grade school?
Well, when I'd go to school, in the meantime, and after the Stotlar School was built, the Pope School was built right next to it on the same grounds up there. And the old school, right where the basketball gymnasium is, the South Side School Junior High, is right where the old Stotlar School sat, and immediately north was the Pope School, they called it. And it's a 2-story building, that's the school. I started there in 1933, very hard of the Depression. As kids, we didn't know we were in the Depression, didn't know what that was. Everything existed like it was. Everybody was hit by it. And of course, most people worry about 10%, 15% unemployment is just deplorable. Herrin had 50% unemployment at those days. From about 30 to 35, there was about 50%. That's every other person in your block was not working. And people learned to share. Everybody helped out. The churches became the centers for people. There was no government aid at that time, not until 35. And the WPA started at 36. They started and worked for $1 a day. And they started a sewing room up in the second floor of the old building. The women worked there, and I think they got paid $1 a day. for the sewing clothes and making clothing at that time. Those were the first government institutions that were brought in that long by President Roosevelt at the time. They started that at that time to try to help out in these terrible conditions that we had with that much unemployment. The mines at that time were, most of them were not working full time. Two reasons. In the Depression, people weren't using them, although everybody burned coal at those times to heat and do everything with in the Midwest. Because we had the largest coal fields in the world right here at Heron. Largest producing here, Ziegler, West Frankfort had the largest mine in the world after Heron. This was the first vein. And it was a tremendous 6-foot vein of coal to 10 feet thick. So we were in the center of energy production, and that's the most important thing for manufacturing. And with the people out of work, the coal, they started using oil engines on the trains. Several of the railroad companies owned mines in this area. They would just buy a mine. Madison 12 out here west of Culp was owned by the IC Railroad, and they bought their own mines. They used so much coal from here to Chicago and all. They used all this coal, so they even bought their own. But they started using oil about that time in 32s, 33s, on up, and started using oil engines, and so that cut back tremendously on the coal issues. And one thing after the other, the whole world was in a depression, truthfully, at that time. Germany, all of them from World War I, was still never come back. Of course, Hitler finally brought it back to 40, but that was the situation. So it was, we'd go to school. We had Miss Irene Hinchy was my first grade teacher, and then Mabel McNeil was my second grade teacher, and we'd have about 30 in the class of kids. One of the things during those years, most of the kids, half the kids, 3/4 of the kids, the parents weren't working at all. They got on relief. They finally put a relief program in. And at that program, they got one pair of shoes, and two pairs of overalls, one pair of shoes, and one heavy coat and a cap to wear. And of course, if you had one pair of shoes, they never wore shoes all spring and all fall till it got really cold. The kids didn't have the shoes to wear, and they just used going barefooted. So some people that moved in here, other parts, couldn't believe me. You know, the kids would go to school barefooted, but it was that situation. You just understood. Nobody questioned it or paid attention to it. That's what you did.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of thing. We played out there in the swings and teeter-totters and stuff like that in a softball field, about all we had to play out there at those times. And of course, they were all covered with cinders from the school burners to keep the mud down. They used all the cinders. Of course, you didn't pay to fall down because you were always skinned up pretty badly. So, any other question you might have towards that?
Well, I know that you told me that you used to go swimming. I don't know if that was your grade school years when you said you used to go swimming at, I believe you said number 7?
Number 7 mines, yes. Well, I was at the later age, about close to around 1940 in my high school years, I used to go in the fall, say in the 36, 7, and 8, out at White City Park here in town. Now the Marlows, John Marlow and his brother George, had all entertainment here, and they had the big dance hall over there. It was famous for all the big name bands in the 30s, 7, 8, 9, 40, up to about 53. And they had the largest swimming pool in the southern part of the state, or in the state maybe, out here on the 18th Street, right by the North Side School, just south of it. And they had 3 large sections, a 2-foot section of water deep, 4-foot section, and a 10-foot. And I learned to swim out there in about 1937. The legs coming down, two large sliding boards, and from one post to the other, one of the boys that we ran around with taught me to swim. And then with that, I started going down and diving off the diving boards they'd catch before I could even swim off the diving board. They had a 1 meter board at one end, and at the other end they had a 10 and 20 meter board, or not 20 meter, 20-foot board. It'd be a three and a 6 meter board. And I eventually learned to dive off the top one, the 20-foot diving board, and do swan dives and jack dives and all that stuff. So I learned early to swim and dive and do all those kind of things. And I'd always keep up with I was the youngest one in our group. Everybody called it a gang or something, in your neighborhood. And everybody lived in neighborhoods. My neighborhood only, for me, at the early age, would be about a block this way and a block that way and a block this way in that space like that. And then we'd go over to the other section where your husband says he lived over on 8th Street. Those kids, we all came over and met at Joe Walker on 11th Street. He's the 200 block, and he had an extra couple lots. We used to play football and basketball there all during the winter months. We would play those, and sometime Jim had one of the big electric trains, and one of the bad days we'd go to the basement and play with his electric train. And we've got a picture here at the Historic Society here of a group of us that was his dad, Joel V., that had the clothing stores here in town, made of us. It's a great picture. All of those kids are dead now, but my brother and I are the only two living of that whole bunch. And we spent a lot of time there. But from there, later we would go down the railroad tracks. There was just 2 blocks from us, the IC railroad tracks going east to the number 7 mine pond. And we fished. We had a place called Clear Hole, where it's clear water. We'd swim over there. And there were 3 ponds there, all connected. And in the winter time, starting in the late 30s, we would go ice skating there, usually at Christmas time when we were out of school. It'd freeze enough to get maybe 2 inches of ice, and for our weight, we could get on it. I even, the other boys had some ice skates, and I didn't. I was younger, but I had a sled. So believe it or not, at the drugstores downtown, we had about 5 drugstores in here. There was McDonald's on Park Avenue and Monroe. Then we had Wagner's drugstore in the half block south. We had the Klein Vig drugstore on Cherry Street, 100 East Cherry, and we had Carr's drugstore on that. And all of them sold some sporting goods, fishing tackle, all kinds of things like that. We didn't have a sporting goods store. So I bought me a pair of track shoes about 1938 at the Klein Vig drugstore. Had the big spikes on them, and I got me a pair of those so I could run on the ice with my sled as fast as they could skate and slide, really go clear across the lake with them. And so that worked out real good, those spikes, if it snowed or iced, until I got me a pair of skates. And then we skated. I think I told you one day about us catching turtles back there. It's only about 2 feet deep in the backwaters, full of willow trees. But there were big snapping turtles that were 1.5 feet in diameter almost.
Oh my goodness.
They would be big ones. And we could see them swimming very slowly on the ice. And the ice only 2 inches thick. And we took a hatchet. We'd chop a hole in big, about 1 foot square, and reach down and grab them by the tail and pull them out. And pull them out of the ground and chop their heads off. They said the snapping turtle would never stop biting until the sundown. He'd keep snapping, which they did too. But we caught a bunch of them one year. We were down there one day and we caught 15 or maybe 18 of those big turtles, almost big as this table, half the size of this table. And what are you going to do with them? Well, a couple of kids took them home and I ate some of them. They fried them up and ate some, but another fellow, the old Italian fellow, had a fish market right here on West Monroe Street. Somebody told him he came over with a wheelbarrow, and he wheelbarrowed full of snapping turtles, took them home with him. So he had quite a mess of turtles to eat that day. But we skated out there every year, built bonfires, and in the summer we fished out there. Later on, and got a rifle. We'd shoot turtles and stuff, snakes out there. We just lived out there in the summertime. And it was only about 6 or 8 blocks away to ride our bicycles over. So that became a main area for us. We'd visit some of the other mine ponds and swim later, but basically that was where we grew up, was around that mine pond. And that mine didn't close till 1940, I think, the actual mining operation. They kept the grounds caretaker on them for the next, till Norge came. And then Norge started dumping stuff in the water that got into that, and it really destroyed the good fishing and everything that they had before the EPA came along and stopped a lot of that kind of stuff.
Well, I know we were talking about, you were saying that there weren't houses built between this, during this 15-year period.
Yeah.
But you told me what changed it. What do you think changed it, brought about?
Well, 2 things. First of all, during the Depression, nobody had any money to build a house. I mean, even the business people were, as you could imagine, nobody had money. Mm-hmm. The school teachers were paid in script, not cash, just a promise that they could talk I talked to Mr. Sond over here at Sond's Clothing, so men's clothing. They could take that in, and they would give them either, if it's a $10 script, they would either give them $9 in cash or $8 in merchandise for that. And then you may have to hold that for 2 or 3, 4 years before the school could pay it off. So it was a lend-lease type of operation. That's the way they got paid. In the grocery stores, everything the same way. So nobody was getting full payment on the dollar, and they just didn't have any way to build a house. Eventually, with the WPA and so forth, the little money started flowing. And then by 1936, they started buying all the land south of here, and building Crab Orchard Lake. It was built by the WPA, built that lake, built the dam, and built the lake, and it wasn't open until about 1940, I think, 40 or 41, I forgot what day it opened. But I stood on that dam in 1940. I had a friend in school that moved over there, and he had a birthday party that summer. I went over to the dam, we stood on the dam and looked at the whole valley. Was bare, it had been cleared, and just the Crab Orchard Creek winding as far as you could see to the east. No water in it yet. And I remember very clearly standing there and seeing all of that. And then it filled up about a half of the lake the first year, and we've had a boat on that every day since then. We've lived on Crab Orchard Lake as we got older in school and all. Mm-hmm. And they'd had 2 swimming beaches, and Crab Orchard had Carbondale, and then at Carterville were boat docks. You could keep your boats, and everything happened at the Crab Orchard Lake from then on.
Something I've been curious about with Crab Orchard Lake, and you said it was cleared when you looked across the valley,
Yes.
and I know that there wasn't, a lot of stuff there. It was farmland and stuff.
Mostly farmland and a few trees along the creek, follow the creek line,
So when they bought the farms and stuff, I know at Kentucky Lake, supposedly there's churches underwater, and were there buildings there did you see any buildings? I've always wondered if there was
All the building,
anything
and everything was cleared and just taken out. The only thing, the structure that actually you could see in the lake proper was right by south of the Carterville. There was an island called Sawmill Island. And this was the high point right off the edge of the creek. They built a sawmill there. So that they used that to the log that came off of, they sawed it up and used it in the construction around there. But that was the only structure I ever saw that was actually out in the lake area. The lake is only practically 12 feet deep at most of the lake. It's a very shallow lake. And at the dam, you might get 18 to 20 feet, and that's about it. So it wasn't deep like Kentucky Lake or the Cumberland Lake down in the Kentucky area. It got quite deep down there.
So why did they build Crab Orchard Lake? I mean, they just...
Well, Kent Keller was the congressman here in the 1936, And he had a dream, and it was something to try to get people to work and to have something to work with. Crab Orchard was built for 3 reasons. Number one, they were going to build a wildlife refuge out there, which happens to be still the wildlife refuge. Number two, it was to be a recreation field, because there was no place in southern Illinois you could go to a lake. Only lakes that were here were mine ponds or a farm pond, and just half-acre little mud hole. And the big muddy river that came through here. So truthfully, there was no place to even really fish. A lot of people would go to the Ohio River at Shawneetown and fish in those days. And we always would go over there, and there was a chain of lakes, old oxbow lakes there. People would go to Big Lake and all these lakes. That's where everybody fished. You'd have to go that far, and if you wanted catfish, you could buy them there, the commercial fish from the river. Well, we had nothing like this in this whole end of the state. So those 3 reasons to build an industrial park out there, because you had to have water. Everybody has to have a lot of water, so we had plenty of water. And also, Crab Orchard was to be a supplement to any of the towns. If they needed water in the summer, they had little small lakes around here we had water in. So it served all these purposes. Well, today, the Fish and Wildlife have taken control. They want to run everybody else out. That wasn't the reason it was here. It was a reason to help the area. And immediately after they got it built, the war was starting. In 1940, it failed. In 41, the war started. Well, they held at the ordnance area. And by ordnance, they meant explosive areas. They built a bunch of, Olin and so forth during the war, built a bunch of huts and things for explosions where they could set the powders out in areas where it wouldn't blow everything up. And that got the first Scottsburg in southern Illinois started working there. They had, we were building, the war was going on in Europe in '39, and so we were selling all over the world, lend lace and stuff, but primarily to the Allies, primarily to England, Great Britain. And so we were manufacturing landmines and bombs out here, all during the whole war up to 46 or so. After the war, after those, there was, like you asked me about guards, that was a federal government ordinance area for shells and so forth. So after the war, and it was roped off, about half of the lake to the east half was all private and contained and out of the things. The rest didn't. You could still use recreation. From Carterville, basically, from Carterville to the dam was open. You could fish, swim, do anything, but you couldn't cross over into this area. They did that all during the war. A lot of the high school teachers would work there in the summer. A lot of the kids that were still in school and hadn't gotten drafted or anything that old could get jobs out there to work in that area. So money started supplying, started circulating, which helped us tremendously here. And then, of course, the war started. All of our young men started leaving. The mines were hurt a lot from the young men. There was nothing, no mines were built, nothing was built at that time, like I say. In the lumber business, everything was under restriction, and it was all, you had to have a Class A or a Class B or Class C thing to buy any material. The coal mines could do anything they want. Anything had to do with the war effort, they could get an A rating. They could buy any kind of lumber they wanted. It'd be a B grade. If it was a school or something, they could get a classification on it. But for residents, there was nothing. They didn't put any of their stuff in that. During the war, too, we immediately were on gasoline ration. Speed limit down to 35 miles an hour was the maximum. And no tires. You couldn't buy any tires. Couldn't buy any cars. No replacements of any type, just parts to repair. This really curtailed in high school years, football teams, basketball teams. They didn't have a bus. They'd go on truckloads of kids, pick a flatbed truck, put them on and go to track meets and so forth. Today, they'd arrest you for putting a kid on a flatbed truck. We'd have 25 of us or 30 of us on there. and so forth. So everything was rationed. During that period also, we had all kinds of drives. What was going on in town was money, to get money, bonds. We stored grease, and we stored any kind of metal, take it down and have drives to gather it up. The different Boy Scouts and stuff like that would gather these up and send them to the war effort. They all went to the government. So everything was curled down really tight during those periods.
Would you like a
Water?
Yeah, I would be glad to. Thank you very much. Was there another question on that? I maybe got carried away a little bit.
Oh, no, I was learning quite a bit.
Oh, I did want to mention the Bald Knob Cross too, and the Boy Scouts. Boy Scouts were big at that time. There was the cabin, used to be a log cabin, they just tore it down here a few years ago, right next to the Heron Civic Center down here. It sat between the railroad tracks and the parking lot of the Civic Center. There was a gentleman, every church had a Boy Scout troop. The Presbyterian church had a big troop, and they called him Pop Bailey. Jim Bailey ran the bus stop, the senior. He was in World War I. He ran the Scouts here. The First Christian Church had a scout pack troop, and the Methodist Church had a troop, and I think the Catholic Church had a troop. We had about 5 or 6 Boy Scout troops, and that was good because there wasn't much recreation of anything other than the Marlowe theaters and the swimming pools and so forth in the summer in town. So they took. We went to. I know I just joined about 1938. And the lake was just being built. And Bald Knob, the knob is, where Bald Knob is, at Alto Pass, is the second highest location in the state of Illinois. The highest is up by, on the northern border, Wisconsin border, but just the natural slope to the sea makes them higher automatically, probably 200 feet. But the Bald Knob is the second highest point in southern part of the state, the other whole half of the state. And they had no cross up there, and they started having Easter sunrise service there. We went down with there was a whole scout troop. We covered the whole tops of that hill, every scout troop in town. We got on a flatbed 1.5-ton truck and rode all the way to Alto Pass, just sitting on an open bed truck. And we took some blankets and we camped out. And I mean camped out, you were laid on the ground and slept. You didn't have a tent or anything. You just laid on the ground out there in the middle of the night with blankets. And I learned a valuable lesson. I put one blanket down and about 4 on top of me, and I about froze to death. All my heat was going down to the dirt from the bottom side. Well, the scoutmasters had a big tent, and they would put about 15 people in there. So, and they had a big bonfire building out there on top of the hill. And we stayed up most of the night trying to keep warm around that bonfire. This was like in the last week of March, 1st of April, and you know what the weather's like around here then. So I sneaked in and crawled in that tent that night and just laid down, and I slept for a little while, and it was warm in the straw. I had a straw on the ground, so I slept there. But about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, the cars started coming for daylight. It was going to be a sunrise service. And they wound around you just like a big snake coming down and up the hill. And that was the second service they'd had there, I think. It was the second one. And they all got there, and they had 2, 3 wooden crosses up there, and they had their services. And after that, we packed up and drove around that area down to Clear Creek and all those bottoms in there in that flatbed truck, and then we drove home. And I remember coming, Crab Orchard was already filling up. It was springtime, floodwaters were starting, and we crossed Old Route 13, which is now completely underwater at Crab Orchard in that area, but the vent pipe, the exhaust pipe was underwater when we crossed it.
Oh, wow.
It was bubbling up underneath. It was that much through, so that was really springtime we were there. But that was a big thing. That was the second year that they had anything on Bald Knob of a church service. So that was a good experience with the scouts. This Hal, he took one bunch of guys, older fellas. They went to New York City, Washington D.C. and back, a whole truck with no money.
Oh,
They
my
stopped
goodness.
wherever they stopped and they begged from a church or something. The kids had no money. Maybe they had $10 for the trip, if that. And they got all the way out to Washington D.C. and saw everything in the Capitol, and everybody helped them along the way. You know, that's the way it did it. You could thumb rides, you could do anything at that time and get along. This was in the 30s. No, we went out there before the war, and they made that trip. It was a 2 or 3 week trip. Everybody got back safe, and, and nobody got sick. And they went New York City. They went everywhere.
What an adventure.
Isn't that an adventure? Now, that's what you call really a Lewis and Clark expedition through the Indians out there. But we did have some good scout troops and some great times, and that helped tremendously.
I was read here lately, actually, because I was born in 1959, so a lot of what I'm learning now is new to me, you know, but of course I'm so curious. But the heights here in Heron, I read that those were actually built for the soldiers returning from the war. Is that right?
Well, probably yes and no. Since no housing was allowed, we didn't have the lumber, and people had the money to build a house during it was restricted because of the war.
Mm-hmm.
They built them because there had to be some housing built, and in this area was damaged so much by the Depression with the 50% unemployment, people just didn't have a place to live. So that was built in about 43, I imagine, and they had people working out here at the ordnance plants. That was a major war effort, by the government.
Mm-hmm.
So they had to have some decent housing, and those were built purposely for that. And I'm sure they knew the men would be coming home, and there were no houses for them to move into. And they built these houses. They built them very well insulated. I put a lot of heating equipment in them, and they would heat for nothing. And they would have a stove, they'd had electric or gas or electric furnaces, like primarily gas furnaces put in most of those places. And they did work. They were well built, well insulated and designed, and are still functioning today out there.
Right.
It's quite
right.
a long time.
Also, I was reading about Norge, when Norge came, and it was in 1946.
Yeah.
But I read that the city officials of Heron actually went door to door, and residents chipped in what they could to help bring Norge here, I guess to maybe build the plant. I don't really know, but...
I'll tell you the story because I'm an expert on that. I lived next to Norge, and across my alley from me. That's my playground, was that field. Norge was built for one reason. The coal mines were getting through in Heron area. It was moving north into West Frankfort, to Cesar, to Waltonville, almost to St. Louis. To Mount Vernon. And we had some fantastic men in this area. O.W. Larla, who used to teach school here, my mother had him in school back in the teens, and we had the Harrison family that had the banks here before, and they knew that Heron was the apex of the coal mining industry before World War I time, and it started eroding all the downhill from that. So we knew the coal fields, and like I said during the press, the trains were starting to take the coal industry out and put oil on the trains, diesels, and so they're going to restricting the use of coal, and all different phases of energy. There was reducing, trying to get rid of coal as usage, so it kept getting lower and lower of need. and manpower to work, and they'd get new machinery, new systems. So it took half as many men to work to get the same amount of coal out. So there was going to be they needed jobs here. And during the Depression, half of the people left here. They went to Detroit, Chicago, and those were the two major things. And I think those people probably has moved back. They moved back to Southern Illinois when they're retired in the last 10 or 15 years, 20 years. The Lake of Egypt down south of Marion there, a lot of the people lived there. But you talk to some people, either the husband or the wife, this was their home, and they all had to leave to get work. There wasn't any work here. And when we were a one industry town, all of it was based on coal and the railroads that hauled the coal. And basically that was it. There wasn't anything else going on around here, no other businesses, until the ordnance plant, after the war was over, they started bringing Digraph Bradley, made things. Biggest one was Sangamo Electric out there. Made transformers and so forth. 3 or 4 companies went in there, and then Norge was coming here. Well, they figured these men, O.W. Larla and the Bracys and Joe V. Walker and Clyde Brewster, these were just a few of the names that were in the Chamber of Commerce. But I think Larla was the catalyst to get this going. We got to do something, or we're businessmen here. Who are we going to sell anything to? So they were the first small town to start going into the cities and getting them out of the cities and bringing them down. We had plenty of labor, skilled labor, men that worked in mines, and above they knew how to repair engines. They were tool and die makers. They had all these skills in heavy duty. So in Detroit was another big city, was outgrowing itself. So they went up and they saw a Norge company made washing machines, and it was in the Detroit area. And Lyle Artis was the general manager, the first man to come down here to manage this plant. He was really a first-class guy. And so I don't know how they convinced him to come down here, because we'd had all kinds of labor problems all the years. And we had the labor trouble at the start of the 20s. And anyway, these men were honest to goodness businessmen, good salesmen, and they convinced them that they could move in and Herron would provide the plant and they could pay it off. So that's where they had to go ask every school kid if you could give $2, $1 to build the plant. We build the plant, they come in and lease it and pay off a bond. They put bond it and they'd pay it back. And within about 8 or 9 years it's paid for. You had a bond, but you put it in, you took the chance. Well, that did 2 things. That made everybody in town interested in that business because you gave them some money. You wanted to succeed. And so the unions worked together very closely because they needed work for their men. And you had tool and die people are big. They had the product lines, and they had offices, they had everything, because this was a national business. And these are kind of businesses that every penny comes from somebody else. It's not just turning the same dollar over every day. You're bringing in money. So they convinced them to come down, and George Anderson was city engineer. He is an uncle of mine, married my dad's youngest sister. And he is a graduate of the University of Illinois in engineering. And he came to town, and he was city engineer. He built that plant for them out here. And like I said, it was a 10-acre field behind my house. I lived only 4 doors down from the old original Stotlar house at 220 South 12th Street, which is still standing, by the way, with logs for floor joists under that house. Doesn't look like a beautiful house now. They've been remodeled 4 or 5 times, but it's still the original spot. And you might say, well, why did Norge build it right here in town? My goodness, that's right in the middle of the schools and everything. We don't want a factory there. Well, they would not come unless there was coal under that ground. And the only place in whole other end of the state that had coal on the ground was right here in Herron. In 1900, when we built the city, The city was built on coal and they, solid coal, and they wouldn't let anybody dig. They could not dig under here, all the mines around us. We had 15 mines at one time surrounded. And I just saw a map this week, that you can get them now from the Illinois Natural Survey, shows all the mines in this part of this country, and everything's undermined. There's hardly any coal visibly left that you could see, pockets here and there.
Oh, I see. So they wanted it built where it hadn't been mined.
It would not sink.
I see, okay.
They would not build. If they hadn't, if the Stotlar farm was not there, it would never been built in southern Illinois, because there was nobody else had any land. Johnson City caved in, the schools caved in. West Frankfort had the same problem. They dug underneath the plants. And all the towns, except Route 13, there's no coal south of there. So Marion is not undermined. Carbondale's not undermined. Everything north of there is.
I see.
So the coal field outcrops, that's why they're strip mining on the edges that comes within 20 feet of the top of the surface. The number 7 mines was 150 feet deep. That's all the deeper it was. That's a half a block. You think of a block, a half a block deep. In energy, it's shallower. It may be 100. And it's some of the stuff by Marion over there where they stripped, it was only 20 to 30 feet to coal.
Oh my goodness.
Some of it outcropped at Carterville. Back in the 1800s, they were scraping it off the side of hillsides or something where it crop out. So that's why all of this was built, and that's why there's a town every 3 miles. Because people don't realize today, they had no cars. This was before automobiles, 1890s, 1900. You just had a horse and buggy. And most of the men had to walk. They had no means of transportation. So they had to walk to and from their work. And winter, summer, whatever, they had to do that. So that's why every 3 miles in southern Illinois you have a community, and every 6 miles you have a pretty good sized town. So most people don't think about it, but that's why it's like a checkerboard down here. Because the mines would only work, maybe they wouldn't get over a mile each way to dig coal. They'd run into another mine, somebody else's mine. And that's what caused some of the explosions, get into the old works, and gas would seep into their mines. So it was a situation there, but Norge came in here on that basis. And the Chamber of Commerce and the unions worked close together. We had members, some of the officers of the coal mine and the Chamber of Commerce were union carpenters and so forth. Tom Cox was the vice president, and he was the head of the carpenters union here for many years. And they all worked together because we had to have those jobs. So Norge built, and then they added on. And then came not Universal Match, but International Staple right by the high school. They came in second. Smoller Brothers came in the late 40s, 48, 49, 50. They started making dresses. And then, like I said, Universal Match came out to the ordnance area. U.S. Powder came out to the ordnance area. And Sangamo came out immediately, electric made transformers out there. And they were Central Illinois and did that. So all of this started together. Then Allen came. And when Allen came, they came from Detroit because they made side panels and they made carpeting and matting for under that. They were out of Michigan too. And we had a problem there because the same thing they tried to do was to get money, build the building, and they would pay us back. Well, apparently that's a new idea. They didn't do it in any other towns. Everybody north of us said, we got coal mines, we don't need them. We get along great. They didn't think they'd dig that out one of these days, which they did eventually. By the late 60s and 70s, they were practically all out. So, but Allen came and they had some argument over who was going to set the heavy equipment. And they had a strike. They said, goodbye, this is your place, not ours. Adios, we're leaving. It's all yours, building, built, everything. Here's everybody that's got their nickels and dimes, walked out. You know, they had a plant that you can't give away today. We got the plant back. So these guys, these same men I told you, went to Detroit, got on their hands and knees virtually to get those guys to come back. And they guaranteed them there wouldn't be any labor trouble. And so actually, the whole city was based on this. We'd lose, if we lost that, there may be somebody else, but that's bird in the hand's worth 10 in the bush these days.
Right.
So they got them back, and then it worked out. They had no more trouble out there. They got it settled, and everything worked good. Norge lasted 60 years. That's quite a record for any plant to last that long in one place. So I think that's real credence to the workers here in this town that they made it work, and we kept that plant here until we're into this crazy situation we're in now, where everything's leaving the United States to go to somewhere else to get cheap labor and everything. So that's a major problem we've got today.
I know when you were talking about some of the things they did to bring work and everything, I was thinking, oh, if we could just do that today, because we need it again. Well, our time is starting to come close to ending, but we're going to talk again, hopefully.
Okay. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, I had just a couple of questions. What was your proudest moment? Did you ever have a moment that you remember that you were just so proud that you were Sam Stotlar? I mean, I know that you've always been proud to be from Heron and proud to be American, but on a personal level.
Well, I have several things, since I think that, of course, we all were exceptionally excited when Heron won the state basketball tournament.
Mm-hmm.
What a lot of people don't know, and this goes back to 1936, was that 1936, the Heron grade school won the state championship here. And they were all kids that grew up out of the South Side School. Every one of them went to South Side School playground. They played all summer, they shot baskets. And Troy Hawkins was the principal and the coach at Southside School. And those boys, Benny Bourne, who was Barney Bourne, everybody knew Barney, he was the county clerk forever, his brother, and the Campbells, Fred Campbell was a star basketball player, and the Lillicks was on there, and a couple of other names you would know, but these boys won the state. At that time, they had, at the Lincoln School, played one of the games for the state tournament. This was in 1936, you understand. The man that invented basketball was there, and I met him. He had put a straw basket, an old thatch basket up, and learned to do that. I think he's from Michigan. I should know his name, and it's well documented. But he was here for those games in 1936 in Heron. Then in 1940, this same team of boys went to state and got second, and got beat out the last second with a final shot by who later be Andy. I'll call his name in a minute. He went to Illinois and became a national champion ball player there. In the last second, they shot and made the basket, and we got beat, would have won the state champion. Now, I have to qualify this because people don't know what the state champion means. We have 6 grades of state champions now in the state of Illinois. From the smallest schools, there was one takes all. If ever big school, little school, I don't care what it is, you had one state champion, and he beat everybody in the whole state of Illinois, every school. So the same thing happened in 57. There was only one state champion. Now, it makes a difference when you qualify who that state champion is. And when you said champion, that was the top of the peak. So those boys came and give out won the state there by one point. The only other time the state Heron had ever been to a state was in 1919. We've got the yearbook here. My mother was a senior in high school. They got 4th in the state at that time in Heron. And nothing, of course, up to these days now, we've been and got a 2nd and so forth in a graduated grade. But those were exciting times. I think those were the apex of Heron reaching upward, because the plants were all here working. People were excited with the basketball team. Everybody in the state knew Heron, Illinois, where it was. I still today meet people in other parts of the state, and I say, from Heron, Illinois, you won so-and-so state champion.
1957
Yeah,
state champion.
they still remember that. I was in Boca Raton, Florida, 2 years ago visiting Harvard's son. He was still alive then, and I was eating at their clubhouse that he would live on a nice golf course and everything, the clubhouse. And I was getting a sandwich, and the fellow was serving it, had his head down, and I ordered a sandwich. He said, "Where are you from?" All the time he was fixing the sandwich. And I said, "I'm from Heron, Illinois." He said, he never looked up. He said, "1957, state champions." I said, "Well, where in the world are you from?" You know, just like that. He said that, never looked up, kept fixing the sandwich. And he was from Aurora, somewhere up in northern Illinois, and was at that age that he was in school, high school, was one of the schools, and he knew that. There he was. He'd been down there for 20 years in
Oh my
Florida.
goodness.
So those things happen all the time. That they remember Heron because of that. So that was a great asset to this community. After it had a black eye in the 20s, here we are, the state champions, and they all remembered that. And gosh, I can mention we had great musicians here too. They were in a lot of the big bands, Benny Goodman and all of that. And we can talk about that later, but my brother can talk to you because he played the bands with these guys. And we have some great musicians here. And the bands, the dances of the White City, we haven't gotten to that, but we'll catch that up on the next round.
We'll do that next
To
time.
tell
That
about
sounds
those.
great.
It's a great time. And it's been a great city to live in. And I just hope that we just keep plugging like they've been. We've got a good administration in the city now, and people are still here and fighting, and that's what it takes. I think we'll come out of this thing national-wise one of these days for long.
I think we will. I know losing Whirlpool,
Yeah.
but we're still here.
We're
So-
still here, and we'll just coming up with something else. We've got the most beautiful end of the state here, and we've got to capitalize on this. And hopefully, if Marion can get that bond issue, that new STAR bond issue through that we have over there to get recreation around here. We've got so much to offer with the hills and the lakes. We've got all the lakes in the world now. We didn't have any before. And the highway system, my gosh, we're sitting in the very center of the United States and going everywhere. So we've got a lot to offer somebody here very shortly that's going to see it and realize how the location is. And we got water running out our ears with two of the largest river systems in the world. You know, that's fantastic to have that water, because the world's really short of water, fresh water, that is, you know. So it looks like we've got a potential of really doing something here in the future.
Well, it's a great place to live.
Well,
It
thank
really
you
is.
very much. I enjoyed visiting with you
Oh, I've
this morning.
enjoyed it too. And on behalf of the library, I want to thank you, and we'll plan another visit soon.
We'll take it to the next gap up, and we can talk all day here, Lisa.
Works for me. Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.